Okay, well, that one's ready to go too, Cynthia, so if you want that.
I know, I want that one. I tell you, I really do. Anyway, let me just introduce once again, I should have been recording when I said that. This is the speaker series on August 14th at Saybrook University. We have speaker Mari Swingle, and she's going to be talking about excessive and uncomplimentary interactive technology use and screen addiction. So now I leave it up to you, Mari.
Okay, here we go. So, the problem. The problem appears that my screen doesn't like me. There we go.
There you go.
I'm going to try and shift the little thingy. There we go. Okay, so bottom line, technology can negatively affect the social and emotional health and cognitive development of its all. And what I'm finding as a practicing clinician is increasingly it is affecting all of us to more and more severe levels. Okay. So the major issue is essentially we fully adopted technologies before we understood their effects on our brains and biology. And there's no other way to put that. We completely assimilated tech into our personal lives, our professional lives, our scholastic lives, etc. And only around 10 years later did we even blink. And now, I mean, we're well over 20, I'd say 30 years into the assimilation, and we're just starting to take notice. But the problem is it's so integrated now, a lot of us really don't know what to do with it and how to dissect the good from the bad. But bottom line, we're all in a live experiment and we really don't know the final outcome. There's absolutely no precedent for this. Okay. And what science is starting to show us is pretty darn frightening. And what I've been doing is essentially mining now 20 years of data. When I first started looking at this, I was looking at current clients. And then I started to go back into, the clinic archives and realized I was essentially sitting on a gold mine. With other technologies or innovations, for example, television, we have data on communities with and without television. We don't have a true pre-post or pre-during with television. So it's kind of a unique data set that I'm sitting on. And of course, with and without is very, very different than pre and during. Okay, so a major issue we're facing is, consistent applications are everywhere. And iTech or interactive technology is an absolute societal norm now. And it's extremely hard to differentiate negative and excessive use from healthy or integrated use. So I always put a qualifier up, and I don't have my big fancy slide, but bottom line, it's not all bad, and I do not want anyone to get that message. I also don't want people to get the message that I'm anti-technology, not by any stretch of the imagination. But I find myself more and more talking about the negatives and speaking to the negatives because the positives are blasted all over the place. And it's the negatives we need to pay attention to. So I've coined a couple of terms, integration and interference. And I think this is a really good way to help categorize our usage. So the positive, of course, is the integrated. And it's where the use of the technology completely fits in. It's central to modern life. It doesn't override or eclipse the development or maintenance of other behaviors or relationships. It's progress. It's when a technology, due to its superior efficiency, replaces other methods or expands a desired trait. In essence, all good. The negative, what I call interference, is when a technology overrides or otherwise rewires desirable states and traits or eclipses developmental phases. Okay, so I have a couple of examples here. So one example of interference is when the application of digital media involves the medium facilitating accentuation or acceleration of a negative or previously neutral behavior. So an example is, for example, bullying in a small clique when it turns into a massive cyber attack across all high school districts or even the larger international community. Another example is when sexual curiosity switches to sexual deviance, such as watching a little porn turns into voyeurism. I've just realized before I go on to the second example, I might want to clarify some terms. Digital media, screen-based technology, interactive technology, iTech, they all mean the exact same thing. It's any interactive technology, meaning where you can engage in exchange by or through a screen, to other technology or to other people through a screen. And I like to make a joke that the terms change as quickly as you know, the new phones, as a generation of phones, but they all mean the same thing. All right, number two, interference is when we have alteration of a natural social behavior or drive to an unnatural dimension. So an example would be when multiplayer internet gaming completely replaces person-to-person socialization or real-life friendships and other relationships. So this is, for example, you know, if you have two boys that, you know, game a little bit and play soccer a bit and run around the park a bit and bug their sisters together, and gaming is just one of the things they do, well, that's normal, modern childhood. But when you have the same two little guys, or for that matter, teenagers or older men and women who isolate with online gaming, don't play with other kids, don't do other things, and their whole social life and play is via gaming. That's your interference. Second example is when the viewing of internet pornography affects the natural development of sexual drive. If people are interested in more of that, I can really get into the sexuality component. It's actually not planned for today, though. So bottom line, it's when the medium replaces interest or exploration of physical human relationships. So back to the pornography example, it's when viewing of porn and masturbatory practice completely replaces the interest in physical interpersonal touch or sexual activity. Okay, three are what I call tipping points. When a person continues with compulsive searching long after the purpose of the original quest has been fulfilled. So this is where you're moving into acceleration or transformation of a behavior to the realm of obsessive compulsiveness. So this is where there's no longer a purpose to the activity. The individual is seeking a state or an emotion, not an objective. Alternately, they can be caught in a state or an emotion. So there can be really simple examples, such as you're looking for a new washing machine, and then you've done the circuit and you know which ones are on sale and which ones you want, but you continue to search and search and search and search. Another example is internet dating. You meet somebody online, you go out on a wonderful date, the compatibility is excellent, and instead of going home and and with a big grin on your face and looking forward to a second date with that same person, you go back online and look for more and potentially someone else. So it's essentially when the purpose can't be fulfilled or there is no endpoint. I call it the disease of moreness. Okay, so those are a few little, I guess, introductory examples, and well, let's jump in. But like a true scientist, under controlled observation. Okay, a bit of a warning. We're only going to touch the tip of the iceberg. There is so much here. So today is just a bit of a teaser, or as we put in appetizers, just a nibble. Okay, so how did I get into this? It was essentially solving a clinical mystery. As Cynthia said, I've worked in as a therapist for many years, and without doing too much chest pounding, had a pretty good reputation working a lot with attentional and scholastic issues with children and behavioral issues as well. And all of a sudden, there are two groups of clients that were emerging, and one was a profile of a child that would get better, and you conclude the treatment, and they'd be back within around 3 months, and all the symptoms would have returned. The second profile was a client who just wouldn't shift at all, and starting to wonder why. Sorry, the interruptions, and I can see you're talking, but I can't see what you're writing. So if you want to rewrite.
John LeMay just said that he lost audio, and he wanted to check in with me around anyone else losing audio. So I said maybe re-sign in, and I wanted to ask on chat, has anyone else lost audio? And Kyle says just for a few seconds. So hopefully it's all coming back. I didn't lose audio at all. John's got it back. We're all good. You can keep yakking away.
Okay, now while we still have audio, could I get a measure of how many individuals are either active clinicians or plan to be active clinicians?
So please go ahead and turn on your camera I'm sorry, your mic, and just give a quick eye. I can tell you offhand, pretty much everyone who's on is an active clinician, but okay, I'll let you all speak for yourselves.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, whoops. Got ahead of myself. Yeah, I mean, no surprise, you could probably see this coming. When I first started to get into this in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the issue was young male children and gaming, and that's why they weren't getting better. And we'll probably get into, the notions of entrainment. Bottom line, 1 hour or 2 hours of neuro a week, and you go home and you game for 10 hours. What is going to influence the brain more, of course, is the gaming. Okay, so it was the epiphany. At a certain point in treatment, it became apparent that excessive gaming had a compounding, if not central role, in the child's symptoms and the development or maintenance of the ailment for which the family was initially seeking psychological services. Okay. And the more I looked at this in therapeutic environments, screen use was systematically being found to be associated with increases in behavioral issues, scholastic issues, emotional regulation issues, but no one was paying attention. Okay. And so these were the issues that are the symptoms for which families were bringing in their children. and for which there was a possibility that excessive or uncomplimentary usage at that time of gaming and didn't take too long for the phones and social media to creep up as well. And what was the general response when I first started talking about this? Nothing to worry about, only the weak fall, and therapists like myself only see disturbed children and families and parents with problems. Yippee. Okay, so the problem grew. And, we ignored the elephants and the canaries, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but what I call a central societal parenting trap. Okay. So hop ahead to 2009, when I really started to look at the EEG on this. Started looking at the elephants, as I like to say. So here are all my elephant slides, okay? So when there's an elephant in the room, I like to hop on board and take a ride. So welcome to Dr. Mari's magical elephant ride. There's my humor for the evening. Okay, so it's very hard to get approval to work with children. So I first started to look at adults who had been diagnosed with an internet addiction, or IA as we used to call it at the time. And of course I was looking at brainwaves. So I did my full cap and my 5-point or my clinical Q. And I compared to both normative and clinical databases. So quick review here, normative databases, it's the typical or normal or efficient brain measurements from a sample of individuals who have no reported or diagnosed psychological or psychosocial issues. So no issues with learning, behavior, mood, addiction, etc. And then the clinical, which is the variant or inefficient brain function measurements of brain activity of people with active symptoms and diagnosis of psychological or psychosocial issues. So individuals with ADHD, depression, anxiety, psychosis, etc. Okay, so just to help us out here a little bit, I'm looking if you're sitting, so with the full Q and the normative database, I'm looking how far you are away from the green X, and the clinical Q or the 5-point, I'm looking at how close you are to the red X and the yellow X. Okay, and my findings. Okay, so with the full Q, I found that 77% of my original sample had a brain deregulation 2 standard deviations out. And I put up my normative curve here just for a reminder of how extreme that is. 95% of us are within. Okay. Something really interesting here was something more was going on with males. And if we look at the deviation count under males, it's almost double that of females. So males were definitely more affected than females. And this is what I found. I'm now, apologies, I've hopped now to the 5-point, the clinical Q. So in the clinical Q, I found that every single person in my sample had a signature associated with hyperarousal, agitation, anxiety, and addiction. 89% had a signature associated with mind chatter, arousal, a specific form of frontal ADHD. 66% had hyperarousal perseveration, fretting, signature we see in OCD, 40% emotional deregulation, and 27% a lack of body stillness, Again, something we see in certain forms of ADHD. I didn't look at anything that was present in below 25% of the sample. I wanted to stay with the strong points. Okay. So there's the formal slide. Okay. And of course, if we take this down a few degrees, it's the big three: anxiety, depression, OCD, and ICD. For individuals who didn't like neuro too much in the EEG, I also did the BDI and the BAI, and it was all supported there as well. Okay. So what we're looking at is an epidemic of hyperarousal, what I now term with patients as anxiety and a form of depression, but it's an anxious depression. It's not a sadness. It's an anxiety-based depression. Okay. So that was, the original findings. And I talk about then and now. So I was mostly looking at what we refer to as digital immigrants. And there's a big difference between digital immigrants and digital natives. So helping with terminology, digital immigrants are my generation and older. I don't mind sharing. I'm in my 50s now. But essentially, we were not born into technology. We became immersed in it, generally speaking, in grad school when we were in our 20s. Digital natives are those who have been born into it. Now, even with digital natives, we're not all the same. So we have, of course, chronological age, the age that we are versus the age of introduction. So somebody who's been gaming since the age of 6 is going to have a very different profile than someone who's been gaming since the age of 9 or 19, or just doing other things on screens. The other is the saturation factor. As I mentioned earlier, if you have a 9-year-old who games a little bit here and there and does other things, that's a very different profile than an individual who does nothing but game. Okay. Okay. So digital immigrants, we're really easy. We have ourselves profiled quite well. And essentially, all digital immigrants, when they have an issue with excessive screen use, they're suffering from some other form of mental or psychological or social interpersonal difficulty. And you very, very rarely hear any of us say all, but this was one of the interesting points is the literature was completely unified. I have never found literature so unified, but I have to qualify by unvested interest. So please, 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 whenever you read anything on this topic, look at the small print of who is sponsoring the study, who is paying for the study. Anyone or things that are not sponsored by gaming companies or tech companies, the lit is absolutely unified. Okay, I already mentioned this, very strong alignment with the big three. Okay, and bottom line, the addiction is serving a purpose. Okay, and instead of seeking professional help or otherwise communicating mental, physical, or emotional unrest to family or friends, individuals seek some sort of solace or shelter in escaping to screens. And of course, escaping to the screen will exacerbate rather than solve or soothe an individual's original problem. Same thing we see with alcohol or cocaine or sex addiction or all of it. It's no different. Okay. And again, for older digital immigrants, it's not if we do or don't use the technology, it's how or why we use it. Always keep in mind, it's not all bad. Okay, I'm going to go through these quickly because I just know I'm going to run out of time. But bottom line, with anxiety, individuals are using the medium as a mood regulator. And you start preferring online social interaction to face-to-face interaction, and then you start to get a problem. And it changes the behavior of the user, anonymity and the shield of the screen, decreased self-consciousness, and I'll go into this a little bit more in detail later, but all interactions are technologically mitigated, so you can control intimacy by timing and quality of communication, which you can't do face-to-face. Okay. Depression, it's chicken and egg. It's both a predictor and a comorbidity, cause and symptom. And oh, this is really fun literature, but bottom line, it's a newer impulse disorder, and it falls smack in the classification of obsessive compulsive. Okay. Example of the anxiety or social connection. So if we just look at how we interact face-to-face versus through a screen, face-to-face and voice phone, they're completely governed by socially predetermined temporal sequencing, meaning there aren't long pauses, and if there are pauses, it means something. It means somebody's ignoring you, or it means that they don't know how to react. There is big meaning behind speech rate and pauses, etc. In texting and email, they don't. I mean, we control it, and therefore we alter anticipatory cycles. So sequencing cycles, so how fast we respond to a text or an email, can be interpreted, misinterpreted, and therefore they can be perseverated upon. So we're creating reward uncertainty in all forms of standard interpersonal communication. So the brain starts to function as it would in a gambling response. And we get increased interest and increased dopamine reactions. Many of us are awaiting responses in a very, very different way than we would with, snail mail or phone, etc. So bottom line is our brain starts to respond as we do when we gamble. And we start to get a little bit high, and for that matter, low and agitated based on the type of cycles we involve ourselves in with texting and email, messenger, etc. Okay. So we're getting into what I call the pull and the high, and what we call process and content. We have varied reinforcement schedule, meaning we don't know precisely what we're going to get, how much, and when. We start to get a mini high every time you engage, and as I originally referenced, it's following the rules of gambling. Okay. We couple this with the arousal of blue light, which does arouse us. If this is done later in the evening, it prevents production of melatonin, and the delivery system is instantaneous and constant. We willfully have to turn things off. Frequently don't. We want the high, and many of us start to destabilize without it. And it's so much more powerful when it's linked into social media, not just looking for the washing machine I referenced earlier. Interesting stuff with melatonin, by the way. Dr. Walker has done some really, really interesting research on this, and found that using a screen close to bedtime reduces melatonin production 50%. And he also found that we get what he calls a screen hangover. Oh, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. It's completely connected to a sleep onset insomnia. And even when we do fall asleep, it delays the natural sleep cycle, meaning we're an hour behind, either not falling asleep or in the sleep cycle. So it directly contributes to various forms of fatigue, physical fatigue, cognitive fatigue the next day. What I started to mention before was the sleep hangover. He also found that this was not only the night that an individual was on their phone close to bedtime, but for 3 days after. And I dare say the majority of us are probably on a constant screen hangover, because most of us are guilty of this. Okay, so coming back to the general, excessive screen usage is doing something to our brain waves, our neuronal synapses, and it's changing functional biological markers. Okay, so an example I have is that of ERP. And I let the cat out of the bag, pun intended, with this group, because you probably know what I'm talking about even before I mention it. But it's a story I like to tell, you know, take you back 800 to 1,000 years. And there's a young man walking through the woods, and all of a sudden he hears a big snap, and he freezes. And the reason why he freezes or really pays attention to the sound is because that snap could mean that there's a large mammal around. And it could be positive or negative, meaning positive, it could be a deer, and if he's quick on his feet, he could, you know, shoot it with his spear and have dinner for his family that night. In the negative, it could be sign of a predator, and if he doesn't get out of there quick, he could become dinner. But bottom line, that snap released an ERP wave, which, as you all know, is something in the olfactory, visual, or auditory field that tells us that we should pay attention to something. Well, surprise, surprise, folks, guess what the dings and the bings of our phone do? So this is part of the constant arousal. And we do know that we all have limits to this before it starts to affect our health. If the brain is reacting in that manner, that we need to pay attention to something. And I have a little joke in my book, you know, where we're reacting as if they're tigers and bears, when it's you know, Sarah posting a picture of her spaghetti. Okay, so I want to go on a little bit to developmental issues now. Okay, so the critical issue is that interactive technology can eclipse or hijack developmental process if it's used too early, too much, and if it's used as a substitute rather than a complement for human interaction and exploration, or what we call play in natural environments, or outdoor play. Okay. Technologies can and do hijack and piggyback and alter natural process, and this is why they have an unnatural or exponential capacity to turn bad. That's why I told the little story of the man walking in the woods 1,000 years ago. That's the hijacking. Okay. So along with too much too early and no alternate, we have no boundaries, no teaching, and no guidance. Talk about perfect storm. Okay. And we have a new reality. So what does early childhood look like? Looks like this. What does primary school look like? I say this. And what does adolescence look like? Okay, it's everywhere. Okay, and as clinicians, you're going to be facing this along with some pretty big cultural factors. Okay, and the biggest one is filling the parenting gap. I don't like to blame parents. They're trapped in this, and they're being fed all kinds of hogwash. There's no polite way of putting this. If you want to go to my website, by the way, I have a nice little article I wrote tongue-in-cheek, 10 things the gaming industry wants you to forget that you learned in grad school about the flaws in the research in gaming in terms of what it's supposed to be doing. But I digress. We have a systematic reduction in functional, financial, and social support of young families. At the same time, we have higher expectations of parenting. Majority of parents of young children are overworked, overcommitted, and just too darn tired. Something had to fill the parenting gap, and iTech did magnificently so. And then, of course, you have the industry lambasting parents with all these notions of how good screen education is for them, including fear-mongering. If your kids don't start early, they're going to fall behind. It's pretty nasty out there. The second one, and this is a real sadness, but it's very, very true, that children have lesser value in the industrialized world. They're considered a hindrance to production, and childcare is now in direct conflict with work. It's all upside down. Okay, so what happens when we have stressed, fatigued, and overworked parents? We have lowered individual and cultural tolerance to natural children's behavior. We diagnose them more with behavioral issues and things like ADHD, and we give them iTech. Screens are the new child management tool, unfortunately. Okay, so I repeat this slide a few times because I feel it's absolutely critical, and this one as well. Okay, so too early. Back to some humor. Everybody knows this guy, right? Okay, and most of you know these three as well, and quite a few others. These are our early developmental psychologists, and what they taught us is all about how babies' brains develop, or as I like to say, how they bloom. And they bloom with face-to-face interaction and touch. They're the portal by which all brain systems learn the regulation of psychological state, including safety, happiness, fear, and anxiety. Very, very important, these last ones. Okay. Or I like to put it, when we interact with little infants, we all tickle, touch, and coo very, very naturally. Okay. When we are not on screens or the infants are not on screens. Okay. This isn't just, well, it serves developmental purpose. And if we look at many of the I'd say cross-cultural games that all parents across the world and all caretakers play with children, they all serve developmental purpose. Peekaboo is the example I always use. It's absolutely black and white. If you look at the sequence of what we do, we cover our faces and then we reveal a happy face, a crying face, a cheeks puffed out, etc. And of course, what are we teaching? We're teaching facial expressions. The other thing we're teaching with the covering is we're teaching the ability to change mood, and then we don't just play this close to the child over the crib or on our laps. We also start to play it distally. So we'll first start with a baby blanket, and then we'll go behind the sofa and behind a door. And what we're teaching there, of course, is safety, and we're teaching that we come back. Very, very important, all these games we play. So yeah, learning of facial expressions and safety. Okay. That one again. If face-to-face interaction as well as touch are absent or insufficient, behavioral, emotional deregulation can and will manifest. So we see anxious attachment and disorganized attachment. Why? Because face-to-face interaction, again, are the portal by which brain systems learn the regulation of psychological state, including safety, happiness, fear, and anxiety, to love and be loved, to belong. And what is happening with the screen? None of this, absolutely none of it. Okay, so we get neuronal pruning, or neuronal Darwinism is the official term. Okay, so what we're finding is that infants and children who use screens too much and too young often have symptoms of failed attachment and evidence of related neuronal pruning. It follows basic evolutionary or developmental principles of if you don't use it, you lose it, and if you use it differently, it will develop differently. I was recently presenting at a conference in Australia, and I had the wonderful opportunity to meet with a wonderful group of pediatricians and learn on this, heading a magnificent study on this. Can't wait for the results. I know the results, but it'd be nice to have the official data. But bottom line, she was starting to see many parents come in because they were concerned with the lack of development of the smile reflex in their children. And she started a little experiment, a waiting room experiment, literally. She asked the receptionist just to look at what the parents were doing in the waiting room, and no coincidence or surprise whatsoever that the parents that were coming in because they were concerned about lack of development and facial expressions of their children were the parents who were on screens themselves and not interacting with their infants and young children in the waiting room. And what just terrifies me here is the complete disconnect. You have parents that were extremely aware that something was wrong with the development of their children, but they had no idea, they didn't make the connection that it was that either their child was on a screen too much, or at all, I would say, as a child, or that they were. Okay. So when a child is on a screen, neural pathways either don't form or they start shedding. This is my terror slide. It's like running a lawnmower over the beautiful blooming brain. Okay. And what we're seeing is emergence of autistic-like symptoms in children without autism. Inability to read facial expressions and emotional cues, disproportionate tantrums and anxiety, and need screens to feel better. So if we use screens as a replacement for ourselves and the environment, children develop differently, okay? So children now not only want screens, they need them. Screens are a part of their development. And if you're not feeling, if you start to cry as a child or make other demands for attention, and you're given a screen, well, when you're not feeling well as an infant, and then as a toddler and a young child, when you're not feeling well, you're not going to want a parent or a guardian or a sibling, or for that matter, a friend. You're going to want a screen because you're going to learn your emotional regulation through a screen. This is a little table I put together in terms of what the progression is of emotional deregulation we learn with screens. Okay. Yeah, and this is just a repeat of that. When screens are used as an emotional regulator, they regulate emotions. It's extremely different than other objects, jingly keys and stuffies. because they all have natural extinction, meaning children grow out of these things as soothers, and they learn emotional regulation versus screens compound. You need more and more and want more and more of them to regulate. Okay. Pardon the repetition, but this is the important stuff. Examples from early education. I think Einstein would be rolling over in his grave. Okay. Example I like to use is baby Einstein. I think this is the only one that was really publicly debunked, but they're all in the same classification. Major study here found that, well, in case people don't know, Baby Einstein was promoted. It was a screen-based program for infants to learn many things, but primarily vocabulary. And what they found is for every hour that an infant was in front of the screen, they learned 6 to 8 words less than children that were not on the screen. And it wasn't that the program wasn't doing what it said it was supposed to be doing. It as I have on the slide here, it isn't what is happening, it's also what isn't happening. So babies are absolute sponges. And when they're watching a screen, they're not paying attention to the larger environment. So they're not hearing parents or siblings talk. They're not hearing the radio. Or I'd like to say hear the television. I don't want to put in watch the television. But the screen eclipsed all other opportunities to learn. And this just shows that, you know, babies learn much more from their environment than they do a screen. By the way, if people are interested, same thing is true for adults. Luminosity was fined, I believe, is over $2 million by the American Board of Trade for false advertising in terms of preventing cognitive decline, Alzheimer's. Essentially, they were accused of fear-mongering. Their claims have been completely and totally debunked. Again, I have an article on this available on my website. It's also in detail in the book. But it's the social aspect that helps elders to not decline. And when elders play screen-based games in groups, it can help, but when they play alone, it doesn't. And if you play over 3, I believe if I have my memory right here, if you have 3 or over 3 half-hour sessions per week, you actually decline. You have cognitive decline. And of course, the lesson here was it wasn't the playing of the game, is that you were getting together with other elders to play games on a screen together. It was a social aspect. So the horrible twist to this is all they did was change their advertising. They're still going strong, but they don't make any research claims anymore. Okay. Now, interesting thing here is all screens are not equal. One of the things I like to point out is I versus E, internet or interactive. Depending on history, the I either stands for internet or interactive. The E stands for electronic. So I is a process, it's an interactive process, and E is a delivery system. So sometimes they're the same. So for example, you're going to have effects of certain forms of arousal due to blue light and how it affects circadian rhythm and melatonin production from both I and E screens. But you're going to have a whole other set of process issues with the interactive. I'm going to skip the children's reading activities, I think, because I know I'm going to. Oh my gosh, I have 4 minutes left. Is this true? Ouch. Okay.
I'm afraid it's true, Mari.
Okay. So what do people want to hear about? Maybe I'll just hop directly to my research then, to alpha.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, we'd love to see some EEG stuff.
Okay.
I think that'll keep people on a little bit longer.
Okay. And I'll come back to this slide if, okay. Big thing, I'm mad at the gaming industry because they always talk about all the wonderful things it does to alpha. And if you all know, alpha is 8 to 12. And if we're talking 8 to 9 hertz, 10 hertz, or 11 to 12 hertz, we're talking about many different things. Okay, so discovery of the too much wave. I almost missed this because the computer program wanted to take it out, but essentially what it is a major, major, major spiking of alpha that I found. I was an absolute mystery when I first saw it, but it was in every single participant, and over the years I went back and had a peek at it. I'm not going to show you what alpha looks like slide, but this is what I want to show you in terms of numerical values. Client, 9 years old, came in for mild issues with focus and anxiety, 2010. The alpha, what we're looking at here is the percentage that alpha increases, and from an eyes open to an eyes closed condition. Most of us know we want a nice little jump there. It tells us that the visual cortex is working well. It's associated with innovation and creativity. We like to see that go up from 50 to 100%. And what I saw here was that it went up 279%, and the child and family was unwilling or unable, I should say more politely, to discontinue. 2014, it's 307. 2015, kissing 600. Identical thing, this time with a 19-year-old, 194, and then we're kissing 600, and then we're close to 650. So this is a direct marker of hijacking. Now, yeah, as you can see, it all going up. Interesting factor. I'm going to jump to the other slide so you can see it. What happens when we see this is the theta beta ratio in the back of the brain starts to tank as well. So our anxiety protector goes down. So this falls right into my original findings of really, really poor theta beta ratios at the back of the brain. Okay, so we have an inverse relationship. Your stress resistant marker goes down and your anxiety goes up, and your alpha burst goes way too far up. So the arrow going up is the alpha, and what we find is a little jump with your eyes closed means you're not too creative. A nice jump means you're creative. And then what we see with folks who really, really have an issue is we have a complete and total hijacking of the creativity. Again, see the slow progression in parental report from 2009 on. Initially, when I used to ask about creativity, when we used to see these beautiful bursts, all parents went, yay, my child is extremely creative. And then it started to slowly switch to, yeah, they used to be creative, but not anymore. And of course, not so surprising, is the creativity stopped when they discovered gaming or YouTube or all of the things that kids now do on screens. It's not just gaming anymore. And then, of course, now, unfortunately, the answer is creativity. No, they're not creative at all. Okay, so just remember, if you don't use it, you lose it. If you use it differently, it will develop differently. It's not if we do or do not use the technology, it's how and why we use it, how much, how often. And it's, again, it's not if we use it or don't, it's the tech override. Unfortunately, abstinence is not an option. And I say treat it just the way you do an eating disorder, with the exception of gaming, because gaming you can just quit. But please use the same models that you use in an eating disorder. Children need to learn to regulate the behavior, and you need to educate the parents that it is as severe. If the parents don't hide the cookies, the kid will eat them. Same thing. And I coach parents to use technology against technology. If they can't regulate it, or it's destroying the relationship with the child, then purchase technology that'll do it for you. Okay. Desire for absolutes. I guess the big lesson here is we're all different. We're really dealing with factors of epigenetics. There actually are individuals out there that can be online and game for 5 hours a day and they're fine, and there are others that deregulate with 15 minutes. And the example I always like to use is that of alcohol. Some of us can consume a half a bottle of scotch and be fine. Others of us, it's a half a glass of rosé and we're loopy. Same thing. Some of us are angry drunks. Some of us are happy drunks and gregarious. Some of us are teary drunks. It's the exact same substance. It's the epigenetics and the environment that causes our reaction. So it's the same with tech. I'm really upset at the tech industry because, as I like to say, they test the sommeliers and then they disseminate the research as if it was done on normal folk. And of course, the tragedy is when it's applied to addicted folk. Okay, so have rules, whatever they may be. Doesn't matter what they are, have rules. And treat the addiction and the presenting symptoms in tandem. Okay, and remember, this one I think is close to my end slide. Remember the 3 Ps. The same device delivers Pokemon, Pythagoras theorem, and porn indiscriminately. You need to regulate and be present in your children's lives, and also know this, for yourselves. Most of us really use tech a lot for work. What role do we want it in our personal lives? What role do we want it in our sexuality, etc.? Really, really think about all these issues. So hope you enjoyed the appetizers, and don't feed the elephants. And these are the issues. Let me just go back to there so maybe people can have a look at all the things we didn't cover. How's that? I made it.
That's great. That's wonderful, Mari. I really appreciate that. Whoever can stay on, if anyone has to go, I certainly understand. But whoever is on, if you have a question, let's pose them now. Oh, Chris Williams has a question that she just texted or chatted.
Okay.
I'll read it out loud. Yeah, I know, it's a biggie. Do you think the DSM and ICD will have to develop new clinical diagnoses to address the negative effects of interfering technology? Why don't I start with that question and then I'll move on.
Yeah, well, how long did it take the DSM to come out with the last version? I don't have any trust in the DSM. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry to put that on public record. I think it's going to be a bottom up. I think clinicians and parents are going to get on this. It's absolutely critical. It's affecting critical areas of development, attachment. What the over 50 set do to themselves is one thing, but in terms of development, it's a big issue. Their gaming addiction is under consideration. It's moving very, very slowly. But if any of you have any clout, start the conversation, put the conversation. We need it in there. It's real. But again, the catch is we're all so different. That's why I keep on using the example of alcohol. Most of us can enjoy alcohol responsibly. But unlike alcohol, we don't use alcohol as a work tool. So it's a very, very confusing issue because it crosses all realms.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions? It's your last chance. Feel free to speak up or type. All right, well, there we have it. Well, thank you, Mari. That was awesome. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone else does too. I'm sure everyone else does too. And we're getting lots of thank yous in the chat. And so I will stop recording